My name is Grace, and I always thought my life was like a picture-perfect advertisement. I had a loving husband, Brian, two wonderful kids, and a cozy house in the suburbs. Our evenings were spent chatting about our days, sharing dinners, and watching family movies. But one event shattered that image, breaking my perfect world into pieces. It was just another ordinary evening. The kids were already asleep, and I decided to work on my laptop in the living room. Brian was sitting next to me, scrolling through his phone and occasionally commenting on the news. We talked about little things, what to buy for the weekend, plans for the upcoming vacation. Everything seemed normal. But then, his phone lit up with a message, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the sender's name. Mia. Who's that? I asked casually, trying to sound indifferent, though I felt a twinge of unease. Brian quickly locked the screen and smiled. Just a coworker. Nothing important. His answer was so calm and confident that I almost believed him. But something inside me stirred. Why had he reacted so quickly? Why was he getting messages so late in the evening? I tried to push those thoughts away, convincing myself it was nothing. But they lingered, nagging at me, whispering that this was the beginning of something I feared the most. The days after that evening were heavy. I tried not to think about the message from Mia, but it constantly replayed in my mind. I kept convincing myself that she was just a coworker, but my heart refused to believe it. Brian became more distant, working late more often, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. One day, I did something I never thought I would. I checked his phone. It felt horrible, like crossing an unspoken line. But when I opened his messages, there was nothing. No trace of Mia. He had deleted everything. That only confirmed my worst fears. That night, I couldn't sleep. The kids were sound asleep, and I sat in the kitchen with a glass of wine, thinking about how everything had come to this. Suddenly, my phone lit up with a new message. It was Alex, an old friend from college I hadn't seen in years. We had started texting a few weeks ago after he wished me a happy birthday. His messages were lighthearted but warm, and they made me smile in a way I hadn't in a long time. "How are you, Grace?" I was just looking through some old college photos of us. "Those were such fun times," he wrote. I replied that I had been reminiscing about those days too. Our conversations stretched late into the night, and I realized how much I enjoyed talking to him. Alex had always been charming, and his words now felt like a comforting embrace I didn't know I needed. The next day, I met Alex at a cafe. I told Brian I was meeting a friend, which wasn't entirely a lie, but not the full truth either. Alex was already waiting when I arrived, and his warm smile instantly disarmed me. "You look amazing, Grace," he said as I took a seat across from him. "How's life treating you?" I told him about my family and the kids, carefully avoiding any mention of the growing distance between Brian and me. Alex seemed to sense there was more I wasn't saying, but he didn't press. "And you? How's life been for you?" I asked, hoping to shift the focus. "Life's okay. Work's fine, but honestly, sometimes I feel like the best days are behind me. Especially the moments we spent together," he said, his voice soft yet deliberate. His words caught me off guard. I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I felt my heart beat faster. Not with anxiety, but with excitement. Was this just nostalgia? Or something deeper? After that meeting, Alex and I began texting more frequently. His attention and kindness filled a void I hadn't realized was so deep. Every message, every conversation made me feel alive again, in a way I hadn't felt in years. One evening, when Brian once again stayed late at work, Alex suggested we meet. I hesitated but ultimately agreed. We met at a quiet bar in a part of town where no one would recognize us. It felt harmless, just two old friends catching up. How are you holding up with everything? Alex asked as we sat at a dimly lit table, sipping wine. Tired, but it's a good kind of tired. And you? You seem like everything's always under control, I replied with a small smile. He laughed and leaned in closer. I always have plans, but sometimes the best things happen when you don't plan them. His gaze lingered a little too long, and I felt a spark I couldn't ignore. I quickly took a sip of wine to distract myself. You seem like someone who keeps a lot inside, he said softly. And you seem like someone who enjoys digging too deep, I teased, trying to keep the conversation light. He tilted his head, smiling. Maybe. But I want to know more about you, Grace. His words carried a weight that felt heavier than friendship. The next day at home, I found myself avoiding Brian more than usual. Every time our eyes met, I felt the walls closing in. I didn't know what was happening, but the tension between us was becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as a harmless reconnection was now a burning secret I wasn't sure I could contain. Weeks after our first meeting, I could no longer imagine my life without Alex's presence. His messages, his voice, his warm words, all of it filled a void I hadn't even realized existed. I knew it was wrong, but every time we met, logic faded away, leaving only raw emotions. One evening, he invited me to dinner at a quiet, intimate restaurant. I told Brian I was meeting a friend, and as usual, he didn't ask any further questions. Alex was waiting for me outside the restaurant. His smile and his attentive gaze made me forget everything else. You look incredible, Grace, he said, helping me out of my coat. Inside, the restaurant was serene, with only a few occupied tables. We talked, laughed, and I felt my heart come alive again. But this time, everything felt different. There was more in his words, in his gestures, something deeper than casual affection. After dinner, he suggested we take a walk. We strolled down the quiet streets, eventually stopping by his car. You know you're important to me, he said, his voice low and sincere. But I'm afraid you regret what we've started.
I didn't know what to say.
How could I explain the turmoil in my heart? But as he moved closer, as his hands gently held mine, all my doubts dissolved. His kiss was soft yet certain, and I kissed him back, feeling something awaken in me that I hadn't felt in years. We ended up at his place. The silence of his apartment was almost deafening, and yet it felt intimate. For the first time in years, I felt desired, seen, and understood. His touch was gentle, yet filled with passion, and every moment felt like a discovery. Are you sure, Grace? He whispered, holding my hand. I nodded, unable to speak. Words weren't necessary anymore. That night, everything changed. It wasn't just about physical closeness. It was about feeling a connection I had longed for. But along with it came a deep sense of unease. I knew this couldn't last. In the weeks that followed, I tried to go back to my routine, but something felt off. I was constantly tired, experiencing mild nausea in the mornings, and becoming unusually emotional. At first, I blamed it on stress, but when I missed my period, my anxiety skyrocketed. One evening, I decided to take a pregnancy test. I left the kids with Brian, telling him I needed to pick up a few things from the store. Instead, I went to the pharmacy. Back home, I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at the test as the results appeared. 2 bright lines stared back at me. I sank to the floor, feeling like the world was crumbling around me. This couldn't be happening. But it was. I was pregnant. And deep down, I knew the baby wasn't Brian's, it was Alex's. That night, I sat in the bathroom with the positive pregnancy test in my hands, feeling like my entire world had collapsed. The weight of the truth was suffocating. How was I supposed to tell Brian? And what would Alex say when he found out? One thing was certain. This secret wouldn't stay buried for long. The next morning, I tried to act normal. Brian, as usual, was too preoccupied with his own routine to notice the storm brewing inside me. But his sudden attentiveness was unexpected. As I stood in the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, he approached me with a concerned look. "You seem tired lately. Is everything okay?" he asked. I forced a smile, avoiding his gaze. "Just didn't sleep well," I replied, hoping he'd drop the subject. His concern only deepened my guilt. He was so far from knowing the truth, and that made the weight of my betrayal even heavier. I knew I couldn't keep this a secret forever, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. A few days later, I met Alex at the same cafe where everything had started. He greeted me with his usual warm smile, but I could tell he sensed my unease. "Grace, what's wrong?" "You look tense," he said, his voice laced with concern. I hesitated, my hands trembling slightly as I held my coffee cup. "Alex, there's something I need to tell you," I said, barely able to look him in the eye. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "What is it?" "Grace, you can tell me anything." I'm pregnant," I whispered, my voice breaking. His face froze for a moment, processing my words. Then, a small, uncertain smile appeared. Wow. That's big news. Is it mine?" I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "Yes, Alex. I'm sure it's yours." He exhaled deeply and reached across the table to take my hand. "Grace, this changes everything. I want to be here for you, for our child. We'll figure this out together." His words were comforting, but they didn't ease the chaos in my mind. I knew how complicated this situation was, and his optimism only made me more anxious. At home, Brian's behavior started to shift. He became more attentive, more present, but there was a tension in his actions. It was as if he sensed something was wrong but couldn't put his finger on it. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, he confronted me. "Grace, you've been acting differently. Is there something you're not telling me?" My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. "No, Brian. It's just work has been stressful, and I've had a lot on my mind." He studied me for a moment, then nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't convinced, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he started digging deeper. The turning point came when Brian discovered my messages with Alex. One evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, he confronted me with my phone in his hand. "Who is he, Grace?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. I froze, unable to come up with an excuse. This was it. The moment everything would unravel. Brian left that night, slamming the door behind him and leaving me alone in the wreckage of our life. I had no idea where he went or if he would ever come back. My thoughts were a chaotic mess as I tried to process what had just happened. I called Alex. "Brian knows," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though tears threatened to spill. "Grace, I'm here. We'll figure this out," he replied, his voice calm, but I could sense his own anxiety. The next day, Brian returned. His face was calm, almost too calm, as he sat down at the kitchen table and motioned for me to join him. "I want you to tell me the whole truth," he said. "No more half-truths, no more excuses. Just the truth." My hands trembled as I sat across from him. It happened. I don't know how to explain it. I lost myself, and you were so distant. I found something I was missing somewhere else. His eyes filled with pain, but he held his composure. "That's your justification?"
No.
"I'm not justifying it, Brian. I know I made a mistake, and I don't know if I can fix it," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head slowly. "Do you even want to fix it?" The question stopped me in my tracks. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. A few days later, I arranged to meet Alex at a cafe to discuss what to do next. I thought it would just be the two of us, but when I arrived, I found Brian already sitting at the table. My heart sank. He gestured for me to sit down. I knew you'd come here, and I knew he would too, Brian said, his tone cold but controlled. Brian, this isn't what you think, I started, but he cut me off. It's exactly what I think, Grace. I've been watching you for weeks, and now I want you to make a choice. My heart raced. A choice? Yes, Grace. Between what's left of us and the mess you've decided to create. At that moment, Alex walked into the cafe. He saw us and froze, his eyes locking with mine but making no move to approach.
Brian looked at me.
You're going to do it now.
Choose.
My heart pounded as I stood there, caught between the two men. Alex waited by the door, while Brian sat across from me, his eyes filled with one last shred of hope. I took a step forward, but stopped. Everything I had done came crashing down on me at once. In that moment, I realized that, in searching for myself, I had lost everything that mattered. I choose myself, I finally said. Brian shook his head and stood up. It doesn't matter anymore, Grace. You've lost us both. He walked out of the cafe, and I stood there, frozen, as Alex slowly turned and left as well. Months later, I left my job and started a new chapter of my life. My marriage to Brian was over, and Alex and I never saw each other again. Now I live alone. While loneliness is sometimes painful, I finally feel free. I've learned that my mistakes have become lessons, teaching me the importance of being honest with myself. One day, I received a letter. Inside, there was only one sentence. I'll always remember you. Alex. I smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. Life couldn't be rewound, but I could move forward. Moving to another city was supposed to be a fresh start, but the weight of the past followed me like a shadow. I rented a small apartment, enrolled the kids in a new school, and started a new job. Life was slowly falling into place, but at night, the silence would consume me. In that silence, I could feel everything, the pain, the guilt, and the doubts. One afternoon, as I was returning home from work, I saw Brian standing at the doorstep of my new home. He had a small suitcase with him and looked tired but determined. Brian, what are you doing here? I asked, shocked to see him. It wasn't hard to find you, he said calmly. I need to talk to you. Not about us, but about the kids. They deserve some stability. I hesitated, but invited him inside. The children were still at school, so it was just the two of us. We sat at the small kitchen table, just like we used to at home. But now, this table symbolized the distance between us, not unity. Grace, I've thought a lot about everything that happened. I'm not here to fix what's broken, but I can't just walk away from the kids, Brian said, his tone steady but heavy. I understand, Brian. I've made a lot of mistakes. And if I'm honest, I don't even recognize who I was in our marriage anymore, I admitted, staring at my hands. Have you thought about Alex? Is he still part of your life? He asked, his piercing gaze making it impossible to lie. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Alex had stayed in touch, but I felt the connection between us weakening with each passing day. Perhaps we were clinging to something that was never meant to last. He's been supportive, but I don't know if that's enough, I finally said. Brian nodded, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. He didn't say anything more, but his silence was louder than words. The next day, I called Alex and asked to meet him at the park where our story had started. When I arrived, he was already there, waiting with that familiar warm smile. But I felt a heaviness in the air between us. Grace, I'm glad you called. I've missed you, he said, his voice soft. I took a deep breath and looked him in the eyes. Alex, you've been my rock through everything. But I've realized we can't build a future on the ruins of the past. I'm grateful to you, but I need to let go. For my own sake, and for the kids. His face froze, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded slowly. If that's what you feel you need, I'll respect it. Just know I'll always be here for you if you need me, he said, his voice filled with both pain and understanding. In the months that followed, life began to stabilize. Brian and I found a way to co-parent without animosity, and Alex became a memory, a bittersweet reminder of choices that changed my life. I spent time rebuilding myself, piece by piece. I worked on being present for my children and on rediscovering who I was beyond a wife, a mother, or someone else's partner. My mistakes had taught me the value of honesty, not just with others, but with myself. One day, while sorting through some old belongings, I found a letter slipped into one of my books. It was from Alex. Inside, it simply said, "I hope you find the happiness you deserve." Alex. I smiled. It wasn't a smile of regret or longing, but one of acceptance. Life couldn't be undone, but it could always move forward. Starting over felt like a dream and a nightmare all at once. The new city, the small apartment, the unfamiliar streets, it was all supposed to represent a fresh start. But the echoes of the past were relentless. Each step forward was weighed down by guilt and uncertainty, and the silence of the nights reminded me of everything I had lost. One evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Brian standing there, holding a small suitcase. He looked exhausted, as if the months apart had aged him. "Brian, what are you doing here?" I asked, trying to mask my surprise. "I needed to see the kids," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I needed to talk to you." I let him in, and we sat at the kitchen table. The room felt smaller with him in it, the air thick with unspoken words. "Grace," he began, looking down at his hands, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about us, about everything. And I keep coming back to one question. Why?" His question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had asked myself the same thing countless times, but the answer still eluded me. "I don't know, Brian," I admitted, my voice trembling. I was lost. I felt invisible, unimportant. And Alex, he made me feel alive again, even if it was wrong. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to judge you, Grace. I made mistakes too. Maybe not the same ones, but I wasn't there for you when you needed me. I can see that now." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For the first time, it felt like we were having a real conversation, not just exchanging accusations or avoiding the truth. Brian stayed the night on the couch, and the next morning, we had breakfast together with the kids. It was almost like old times, but we both knew things could never go back to the way they were. Before leaving, he turned to me and said, "Grace, I'm not asking for us to fix this. I think we've both moved too far apart for that. But I want to be here for the kids. And if you ever need anything, well, you know where to find me." I nodded, unable to speak. Watching him walk away felt like closing a chapter one wasn't ready to let go of, but it also brought a strange sense of peace. Weeks later, I received a letter from Alex. It was unexpected, and seeing his handwriting made my heart ache. "Grace, I wanted to give you time and space to figure things out, but I also want you to know that I'll always care for you, no matter where life takes us. You've changed my life, and I'll forever be grateful for that. Take care of yourself and the little one. Alex." Reading his words brought a bittersweet smile to my face. Our time together had been brief, but transformative. He had been a chapter in my story, not the whole book. I realized that my mistakes didn't define me. They taught me. I started attending therapy, focusing on my children and myself. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my life, not as someone's wife or lover, but as Grace, a woman who had faced her flaws and found the strength to keep going. One evening, as I watched my children playing in the park, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. My past would always be a part of me, but it no longer controlled me. For the first time, I was free.
Please subscribe to our channel Stellar Stories. We have new amazing stories coming out every day. Thank you.